Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. It is September 24th, 2023, and my name is Glenn Rawson. Welcome to our devotional. I got home just about an hour ago from speaking in California to the California Pioneer Heritage Foundation. I'm going to mention that a little bit later. What a wonderful group of people. And as far as I know, it's the only mission in the church dedicated entirely to just teaching church history in the schools and to anyone who happens to come. It's a very unique mission and a very unique set of missionaries. So I had a great time out there with them over the last 2 days. And then earlier on Friday, I came home with a tour group from the St. George Open House Tour. We spent 3 days going down and around through St. George and then back up through along Highway 89, back up through Circleville and Richfield and on up through Manti. They were also a wonderful group of people, and we had so much fun. Really, really got close, bonded well. We had a lot of fun together. So just a quick announcement. On October 3rd is my next tour. And this one is going to be called the Fall Colors Tour. We will leave from here in Salt Lake, go up through Idaho, up into Wyoming. I'm going to show you something up there that not a lot of people know about. It's called Mormon Row in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And there are missionaries up there who will present the story of Mormon Row and the Molten Barn. Going to take you up there, and then we'll come back through touring temples and tabernacles and looking at the beautiful fall colors of the mountains. That starts on October 3rd. Now, there's still room on that tour, and if you would like to come with me and hear all the stories of settlements and saints and temples and tabernacles all the way up through into Idaho and Wyoming, go to glennrawsonstories.com and click on the travel schedule, and it's right there. So as always tonight, I ask you to have a prayer in your heart that hopefully something that is said here tonight will be of benefit and meaning to you or to someone else. And again, please feel free to share these stories, and please let me know how many of you are watching and where you're watching from. As mentioned, I went to California and I spoke about the Mormon Battalion when I was there. I shared about a half a dozen stories, and these are 2 stories that I'm going to share now that will be coming out probably next year in the new book, Men and Women of the Mormon Battalion After the March. This is the first story. In 1878, Margaret Phelps, the wife of Alva Phelps, recounted the following to Daniel Tyler. Those hours, she said, in July 1846, when the call to serve in the Mormon Battalion came, we were traveling along the way when the call came for my husband to leave us, she said. It was midnight when we were awakened from our slumbers with the painful news that we were to be left homeless and without a protector. I was very ill at the time. My children were not well. My babe was also extremely sick, but the call was pressing. There was no time for any provisions to be made for wife or children. No time for tears. Regret was unavailing. He started in the morning. I watched him from my wagon bed till his loved form was lost in the distance. It was my last sight of him. 2 months from the day of his enlistment, the sad news of my bereavement arrived. End of quote. July 20th, 1846, Alva Phelps had marched off with the Mormon Battalion towards Fort Leavenworth. While at Fort Leavenworth, he became ill, and when the battalion left the fort on August 12th, Alva was still sick, but he kept going. Then, while camped on the Arkansas River, Henry Standage, a fellow battalion soldier, wrote the following in his journal. Wednesday, September 16th, 1846. Brother Alva Phelps died this evening. I believe that calomel killed him, as he was a faithful brother and he had not been sick but a little. I helped dig his grave by torchlight. After I'd returned from digging Brother Phelps's grave and had laid down in my tent, some of the battalion called me to look at a star in the east that continued to move both north and south and up and down. It was directly in the course that we had traveled. When Brother Phelps was taken sick, he pleaded against his being forced to take calomel and said he would get well without it. Though this seems a sad tale to relate, it is the choice that Margaret made after Alva's death that makes the entire story of the men and women of the battalion so utterly astonishing. Sister Phelps said, quote, "The blow entirely prostrated me. But I had just embarked on the sea of my troubles. Winter found me bedridden, destitute, in a wretched hovel which was built upon a hillside. The season was one of constant rain. The situation of the hovel and its openness gave free access to piercing winds, and water flowed over the dirt floor, converting it to mud 2 or 3 inches deep. No wood but what my little ones picked up around the fences, so green it filled the house with smoke. The rain dripping and wetting my bed, which I was powerless to leave. No relatives to cheer and comfort me. A stranger away from all who ever loved me. My neighbors could do but little, their own troubles and destitution engrossing their time. My little daughter of 7 was my only help. No eye to witness my suffering, but the pitying one of God. He did not desert me." How we made it through, I don't know, but somehow we did. And we found our way to the Rocky Mountains in the West. Finally. End of quote. She kept going. And she kept the faith, notwithstanding the trials, the testing. She kept going, and she proved to God Almighty, to herself, and to her posterity that she was and would be true and faithful to the very end, as I hope we all will, come what may. Second story, also in the Mormon Battalion book, forthcoming. The Mormon Battalion was called and volunteered out of western Iowa and left the Latter-day Saints there on the Missouri River on the Iowa side and marched down to Santa Fe and on into California. Why? Because they were a part of the United States Army in the Mexican War in 1846. The whole Mormon Battalion March is a little-known event for most church members, yet it was of huge import. And if you understand the implications of that, even now it is huge. Brigham Young once referred to the men of the battalion as the salvation of this church. Well, here's one story from the March of the Battalion that I want to share. December 11th, 1846, along the San Pedro River in southeastern Arizona. The men of the Mormon Battalion continued their grueling march for California. They'd come down through Iowa, down into Kansas Territory, and from there to Santa Fe and across New Mexico, and now were crossing into southeastern Arizona. As they came along the San Pedro River, wild longhorn cattle roamed the hills above them. They'd been abandoned and left behind by Mexican ranchers who had been driven off by Apaches some years before. It is reported by Daniel Tyler of the battalion, and there are conflicting reports of what started it, but all of a sudden, that wild herd of longhorns became startled and started running towards them. Some of them scattered from the hills, but some of the bulls in the herd charged right into the camp of the battalion. And the men began to open fire into the bulls. Pandemonium broke loose. Dozens, many more. They described dozens of raging longhorn bulls, wild, stampeded down out of the hills and charged right through the battalion camp, goring the mules, overturning wagons. The men ran in every direction, dodging the bulls, shooting as they ran. Other men ran for cover, and some climbed right up into the trees to get away from the bulls, or they just dropped to the ground and the bulls jumped over them. One private, Amos Cox, was hooked by the horn of one bull in the thigh, right where it adjoins the torso, and thrown 10 feet over the head of the bull and down the length of the bull's body and behind him. Sergeant Albert Smith was trampled by a bull and had 3 ribs broken. Another man was severely bruised when a bull charged him, and the horns passed on either side of his body and pinned him against a wagon. One diary reported, quote, "The bulls are as daring and savage as tigers." Another man was being chased and suddenly just dropped to the ground, and the bull leaped right over him. Now, the part of the story I want to tell you is about Colonel Philip St. George Cook. He was the commander of the battalion, and according to one diary, he was leading the battalion mounted on a white mule, and he watched this whole fray from a distance nearby. When all of a sudden, a black bull about 100 yards away turned and charged right at Colonel Cook. Standing near the colonel was Corporal Lafayette McCullers Frost. Colonel Cook recorded the following, quote, "I was very near Corporal Frost when an immense cold black bull came charging upon us, 100 yards distant. Frost aimed his musket, a flintlock, very deliberately, and only fired when the beast was within 6 paces. It fell headlong, almost at our feet," Cook said. Well, of course, Cook was relieved and impressed. He commended Frost as one of the bravest men he ever saw, but he also said he wanted no further proof of his courage. Well, in a detailed memoriam of the event, the ranking general authority among the Latter-day Saints on the march, Levi Hancock, composed a poem, part of which reads as follows: "The colonel and his staff were they mounted in witnessing the war. A bull 100 yards away eyed Colonel Cook as easy prey. But Corporal Frost stood bravely by and watched the bull with steady eye. The brute approached near and more near, but Frost betrayed no sign of fear. The colonel ordered him to run. Unmoved, Frost stood with a loaded gun. The bull came up with daring tread. When near his feet, Frost shot him dead." End of quote. That story, recorded by multiple witnesses, is true. And interestingly enough, it would be one of the only battles the battalion would actually fight. And the man who was part of it went down in legend, as it were, representing the bravery and daring of all the men of the battalion, Corporal Lafayette McCullers Frost. But the part of the story that no one ever tells, perhaps no one knows, is that Corporal Frost, the volunteer who answered the call of a prophet on that march, would never live to return to his family, to his parents. Daniel Tyler wrote the following: "On the 8th day of September, 1847, Sergeant Frost, the former brave corporal on whose memory the battalion loved to dwell, succumbed to the fell monster, death. No eulogy on his character is needed. Suffice it to say, he was a man of few words, but abundant in good deeds. His remains were interred a half-mile southeast of town. End of quote. To many members of the church, the march of the Mormon Battalion is all but forgotten. But there are those in California and in other places where the battalion ended up who are determined that we do not forget. From children of the 4th grade all the way up to the most grown adults, everyone is invited to know the story and should know the story of this remarkable march of infantry. Now, this last week, and I didn't get the opportunity, but this last week marked the 200th anniversary of the prophet Joseph Smith being visited by the angel Moroni. So in honor of that event and of September 22nd, 1827, I would like to share the following story. God does much of his work by mortal men, and sometimes so much depends on those men. Monday morning, September 22nd, 1823. 17-year-old Joseph Smith Jr. climbed up the forested west face of a hill later to be called Cumorah. The night previous, Joseph had been visited by an angel who had told him of an ancient record buried in that hill, and then the angel had showed him by vision the exact place where the record was buried. Joseph now stood before a large stone that covered that record. It was too big, too heavy to lift. So Joseph found a lever and with a little exertion raised it up. Under the stone was a box formed of stones mortared together with cement. And inside that box was an ancient record written on gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of the Americas. Quote, on attempting to take possession of the record, a shock was produced upon Joseph's system by an invisible power which deprived him in a measure of his natural strength. He made another attempt, but was more sensibly shocked than before. Calculating that he needed to try harder, Joseph reached again when his strength failed him more than at either of the former times. He exclaimed, "Why can I not obtain this book?" And from nearby came a voice, "Because you have not kept the commandments of the Lord." End of quote. Reference, Messenger and Advocate, Volume 2, page 198. That was the angel of the Lord, Moroni. Joseph had been warned in coming to Cumorah that he must have no other object in view in getting the plates but to glorify God. He realized that all of a sudden his thoughts had been tempted of the adversary, and Joseph, his thoughts, had sought the plates to obtain riches. Joseph was deeply humbled and prayed for forgiveness. When the heavens were opened and the glory of the Lord shone round about and rested upon him, while he thus stood gazing and admiring, the angel said, "Look." And as he thus spake, he beheld the Prince of Darkness surrounded by his innumerable train of associates. All this passed before him, and the heavenly messenger said, "All this is shown, the good and the evil, the holy and impure, the glory of God and the power of darkness, that you may know hereafter the two powers, and never be influenced or overcome by that wicked one." End of quote. 1 year later, September 22nd, 1824, Joseph again visited the place where he found the plates the year where he had found the plates the year previous. Now, Joseph fully expected to carry them home with him that year. He removed the plates from the box, and then thinking there might be something else in the box of monetary value, he set the plates down, turned back, and carefully covered the box again. He turned around to take the record again, but it was gone. He was much alarmed. He kneeled down and asked the Lord why the record had been taken from him. And once again the angel appeared and reminded him that he had been commanded not to lay the plates down. He was permitted to open the box again, and upon seeing the plates once more inside the box, he reached for them, but was hurled back upon the ground with great violence. Joseph returned home, weeping with disappointment, aware that his family would expect him to bring the plates home with him. Joseph expected to get the plates in 23 and failed, 24 and failed, 25 and failed, 26 and failed. He was told in 26 that if he didn't get them the following year, he wouldn't get them at all. The commandments of God are strict, not mean, not cruel, not vindictive, just strict, demanding. My dear friends, it's not enough for you and me to be willing to keep the commandments of God. We have to be able. We have to practice obedience and charity. Practice becoming godlike until by the grace of God, we are. And Joseph was a case in point. There is so much to be learned from what Joseph went through. And finally, 22nd of September, 1827, Joseph was given the chance to take the plates. And then, just after midnight, those plates were given to him, and he went home with them. Thank the Lord, Joseph didn't give up. Thank the Lord for the miracle of the Book of Mormon. Thank the Lord for the miracle of God's grace that empowered Joseph to receive it. How has the world been changed by that book? Praise God that Joseph finally succeeded. Next story. I'm indebted to Fran Coughlin, who tells the following story, and I quote from her account. She said, I have driven across the Mojave Desert from Salt Lake to San Diego several times in a 16-year-old Honda Pilot. She said, I made this trip on my own as a senior female, meaning a senior citizen female. My son and his family lives in California, so I was doing this for the purpose of seeing my kids and grandkids. Before I left, it's time I had a prayer that myself, the car, and all else would function properly, including the tires, as I was on my way home from California on one of these trips. She said, I made it to St. George. I always stop in St. George to fill up on gas and usually to get something to eat. On this particular trip, I had prayed, as always, to have a safe and non-eventful trip. However, she said, this time, she pulled into St. George to a fast food restaurant, and after getting her gas, ordered some food. As she was waiting by the window for her food, all of a sudden, her vehicle started to shake violently, making a metal grinding sound, metal against metal. Fran says, I kind of panicked and turned the car off. Her food was handed to her. Fran said a quick little prayer, Lord, what do I do? And the impression came to her. Keep going. Continue the journey. So Fran started the car up. No shaking. No more grinding sounds. She pulled out onto the road and again offered another prayer. Should I get out on the freeway? Should I keep going? She felt the impression. Keep going. Car seemed normal. So she continued on her way, knowing that that car could not be normal. You understand? After that experience, she continued to pray all the way from St. George clear up to Salt Lake. As she was getting closer and closer into Salt Lake, she kept getting the impressions to keep the speed of the car right between this and this. And don't stop for anything. Well, she said, normally I would stop in Salt Lake where my husband worked and say hi to him, but she had the impression, don't stop. Keep going. And after much prayer and guidance all along the way, she arrived home and was very happy to be there. The next day, Fran got in the car and took it to her mechanic. He opened up the hood, looked it over, and discovered that one of the belt pulleys, the serpentine belt, was shattered, was gone, and that's what had caused the shaking and the noise. According to the mechanic, there was no way that car should have ever made it from St. George to Bountiful. How did she make it? Prayer. Fran said, I was very thankful. I know, she said, the Lord hears our prayers and is mindful of our needs. End of quote. And I would add, even in the little things, yes, if necessary, God gets right down in the grease with us. Okay, let's take a break for just a moment. Are you okay? I've had such a wonderful week with good people. It's hard to be sad when you're out with the saints, teaching and learning the gospel, standing on sacred ground. I really invite you to come. If you have any way to come with us on one of these tours. Not only is it a fun educational experience, a spiritual experience, but the people you get to meet, oh, they are marvelous. Now, in May of 2024, I'm going on a phase 1 church history trip. I'm taking a group of people and starting in Philadelphia and coming all the way to Nauvoo and Carthage. It's almost 2 weeks of nonstop stories and sacred sites. If you're interested, go to funforlesstours.com and come with me. I also wanted to let you know, and I don't have a copy to show you, I kept forgetting to grab it, that the new season 4 book, When Faith Endures, it's out. 52 stories that I've shared on these firesides over the last several years. 52 stories are written up in that book. It's available for free to the VIPs, but any of you who want a good evening read, a good relaxing evening read, it's available at glenrossenstories.com. I would be honored. And one last thing. In June of 2024, Dennis Lyman and I are going to do a phase 2 church history trip. We're taking a group of people, 2 groups of people, across the Pioneer Trail. From the end of Parley Street to Iowa City and the handcart camp, to Winter Quarters, Florence, Chimney Rock, Scotts Bluff, Fort Laramie, and on, Martin's Cove, Devil's Gate, and all the way into the valley. It's a beautiful experience. And you know, one of the beauties of that trip is the sacred sites are still there. The ruts are still there. They haven't been covered over with parking lots and urban sprawl. You can see the same scenery across that trail that your pioneer ancestors did. If you're interested in coming on this Pioneer Trail tour with me and Dennis, go to historyofthesaints.org. I'd love to have you. Next story. This next story is coming out in the book next year called Divine Interventions. Sometime after the year 1870, a remarkable event occurred in Kanab, Utah, that to me is astonishing and worth considering. It seems that 20 head of valuable horses came up missing in Kanab. Most of those horses belonged to Jacob Hamblin, some belonged to Zadok Knapp Judd, and others belonged to people there in Kanab, says the record. Well, the men mounted up and went after them. They tracked the horses to an area called Three Lakes. Now, they could tell that the horses were being driven as their tracks showed that the horses were running. The men assumed that Indians had stolen them, that had happened before, and they searched for days. They could not find the horses. So with no other option, they went back home to a local blacksmith named Thomas Robertson. Robertson had a reputation for being able to find lost things. Robertson told them they would have to wait until dark when the stars were shining. When night came, according to the family record, when night came, grandfather went out, looked at the stars, and did a little figuring and told the men that their horses were up in the head of a canyon called the Muddy, about 20 miles from here, over by Mount Carmel, and that 2 white men had driven them off. Sure enough, the horses were there, and the 2 white men, too. The men were strangers from Nevada. Many such instances, the record continues, as losing oxen and cattle, or some valuable unreplaceable tools or axes, have been recovered from being lost in the hills and couldn't be found after hours and days of searching. One time, Thomas Robertson told a man in Orderville where his lost cow was, right to the knoll and cedar tree she had hidden behind. This gift that grandfather had became known all over the southern part of the country, and Panguitch even wrote an article of the incident of the cow in their newspaper. Thomas Robertson was a man of faith, obedient to the prophets of God. He lived a life according to the covenants to the end of his days. So what about this gift of reading the stars? I have no idea. No idea what this gift is or how it works. For that matter, and this is my own experience, I do not comprehend the physics of divining rods. I've seen them work, of Leohonas, or for that matter, of seer stones. In fact, there is more of the Lord and his ways that I don't understand than what I do. But I have learned this: if the prophets don't condemn, neither should I. And for all these matters of spiritual gifts that people have, I will look to the prophets, and I will wait until the Lord makes all such mysteries known. And to the faithful, he will. Okay. This story is also coming out soon in the book of stories about prayer. It's well known and understood that parents generally teach their children and set the example of right and wrong, right? But occasionally there are those moments when it somehow happens to be the other way around. One Sabbath day, Father took down his rifle and walked into the woods to go hunting. He hadn't gone far when he came upon his beloved daughter, only about 8 years of age, down on her knees, pouring out her heart to God. According to contemporary sources, she besought the Lord in behalf of her father, and the force and efficacy of that prayer entered into his heart with such power as to convert him, to lead him to faith in Christ the Lord. It is said that her father's commitment to the Savior changed that very day as he listened to the wailing of her young heart on his behalf. Years later, so converted was that father and his whole household that worship meetings were often held in their home. And that devout daughter, so filled with faith and mighty prayer, would influence others to find faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. That young father's name was Isaac. And that beloved and faithful daughter, that young woman of prayer, Emma Hale Smith, the future wife of Joseph Smith the prophet. Last story for tonight. The year was 63 BC, and the Nephites were in dangerous straits. Lamanite forces had captured a significant number of cities, major cities, on their eastern seaboard, and were moving up and threatening the capital city of Zarahemla from the north and from the east. Meanwhile, Lamanite forces had split and gone over onto the West Sea south and had conquered several cities in that region. The intent was literally to surround Zarahemla with Lamanite forces and conquer it. If these advancing forces in the west were not stopped, the capital city would be surrounded and it would fall. Captain Moroni, Lehi, and Teancum fought to hold the ground that they had and regain their lands in the east. And then they had appointed Helaman and 2,000 teenage warriors to regain their cities in the west under the command of Antipas. These stripling warriors were only teenagers. Stripling means young men passing from boyhood to manhood. Stripling comes from the same word as sapling, tall, skinny, young boys. These stripling warriors had fought then the battles of Antiparah and the battles of Mulek. And by the marvelous miracles of God, we all know these stories in the Book of Mormon, the stripling warriors had succeeded in reclaiming both of those cities, Antiparah and Mulek, and that without losing a single man. But now there remained one last major city that the Lamanite forces held for Helaman and the boys to take back. It was the city of Manti. But all the Lamanite forces had gone into the city of Manti. It was heavily fortified and impossibly garrisoned, so much stronger than Helaman and the boys. After their recent defeats and deceptions, the Lamanites would not be decoyed. They would not leave the security of Manti's walls. The striplings couldn't attack the city directly. That was suicide. They'd be slaughtered. Nor could they lure the Lamanites out by stratagem. And so it became a standoff. Helaman and the boys and the other Nephite warriors surrounding the city of Manti, and the Lamanite forces inside the walls, comfortably situated. That wait, that standoff, stretched into weeks and then months. The Nephites ran out of food. Emboldened and with full stomachs, the Lamanites launched a series of guerrilla attacks on the increasingly beleaguered Nephites. Starving, weary, and finally discouraged, those stripling warriors that had fought with so much faith in their two previous battles now faced the greatest battle of them all. Not the battle with the sword, but the battle against fear. The battle against discouragement, the battle in here. Helaman, their captain, described these tense events this way, quote, "We were grieved and also filled with fear," meaning him and the boys, "lest by any means the judgments of God should come upon our land to our overthrow and destruction. Therefore, we did pour out our souls in prayer to God, that he would strengthen us and deliver us out of the hands of our enemies." Alma 58, 9 and 10. Please notice that at that greatest moment of fear, discouragement, and despair, they did not turn inward and suck upon their fears and make it worse. They turned upward to God in prayer. And he heard them. Helaman continued, "The Lord our God did visit us with assurances that he would deliver us, yea, insomuch that he did speak peace to our souls, and did grant unto us great faith, and did cause us that we should hope for our deliverance in him. And we did take courage with our small force, and were fixed in a determination to conquer." End of quote. Alma 58, 11 and 12. And then, with no more men, no more supplies or arms than what they had had before, Helaman and the boys went forth and by genius defeated the mightiest army of the Lamanites on the western front and took back the city of Manti. Now, of course, the focus, the battles that get all the attention, are on the eastern front. Moroni, Lehi, and Teancum with that lance, Amalickiah and his brother Amaron. But if the boys on the west had failed, Moroni couldn't have succeeded on the east. Moreover, understandably, we laud Helaman and the 2,000 stripling warriors for their faith and courage in pitched battle. Yet it was that third battle at Manti that tested their mettle as men the most. The fight against discouragement, despair, depression, fear. My beloved friends, it remains the same for all of us. It's the same battle. It matters not what other wars we win out there if we cannot defeat the demons and fears in here. And you will. Look unto God with faith and be prayerful. I love the Lord. He lives, he is with us, and he has all power. Until next week, good night and God bless you.